A wheelchair slammed into a door hard enough to crack the frame. A coffee mug flew across the room and shattered against the wall. Broken glass scattered across the floor. A woman ducked, then stood right back up. "Get out," a voice roared. "Get out like all the others." The man in the chair had a thick neck, a gray beard, and arms still built like a bull. His legs didn't move. They hadn't moved in months. 12 people had walked through that door and 12 had run. She was number 13. Her name was Rosa Delgado, and she had a boy at home and $11 in her purse. She did not run. She bent down and started picking up the glass. What happened over the next 3 weeks in that rain-soaked house would break a man harder than any bullet ever had. Stay with me on this one. Now here's the thing you need to understand about Cutter Malone. He was not always a man in a chair. For 30 years he had been the president of the Iron Saints, an Oakland motorcycle chapter that other clubs crossed the street to avoid. Men twice Rosa's size went quiet when he walked into a room. He'd broken jaws with those hands. He'd settled arguments that other men would have needed lawyers for, and he'd settled them in about 4 seconds. Then one wet night on the highway out past the port, a car came up beside him with the lights off, and by the time he understood what was happening, it was already done. 2 shots. His bike went down at 60 miles an hour. He lived. His legs did not. That was 8 months back. 8 months of a body that wouldn't do what he told it to do. 8 months of being lifted, wheeled, and looked at with that soft pity that made him want to put a fist through the wall. And Cutter had money enough, from years of things nobody asked about, to hire help. So he did. He hired one assistant after another, and one after another they quit. The first one lasted 2 hours. The second made it to lunch. A big kid who used to bounce at a bar downtown got through a day and a half before Cutter threw a plate at his head and he was gone. There was a nurse from an agency who wore rubber gloves the whole time, like Cutter was something you could catch, and she made it 4 hours. There was a young man who kept calling him Buddy and got a phone book thrown at his chest for it. 12 of them. Cutter kept a running count in his head like it was a score. He wasn't proud of it exactly, but he wasn't sorry either, because here's what he believed deep down where he didn't say it out loud. He believed they were all there to feed on him, to watch the great Cutter Malone struggle with a spoon, to take a paycheck and go home and tell their families about the crippled old outlaw who couldn't wipe his own chin some mornings. So he pushed. He tested every single one of them. And every single one of them failed. Rosa Delgado walked into that house on a Tuesday because the diner had cut her hours and rent was due Friday. That was the whole reason. There was no destiny in it. Her cousin cleaned houses for a woman who knew a man who was looking for help with a difficult client, and the pay was double anything Rosa had ever made, and difficult she could handle. She'd been handling difficult men her whole life. Her son, Mateo, was 8. His father had been gone since the boy was 2, walked out to buy cigarettes one night and simply kept walking, the oldest story there is. Rosa had learned a long time ago that you don't get to choose easy. You just choose to keep going. She worked doubles. She stretched a chicken across 4 days. She never once let Mateo see her cry, and believe me, there were nights. She brought the dog because she had nowhere to leave him. Diesel was a German shepherd, old now, gray around the muzzle, one hip that clicked when he walked. He'd been her father's dog before her father passed. Rosa figured she'd tie him on the porch, do the interview, and be gone. That was the plan. The house sat at the end of a dead-end street with a chain-link fence and a yard full of weeds. 3 motorcycles were parked out front under a tarp. A man with tattoos up his neck answered the door, looked her up and down, and laughed. "You," he said. "Lady, you got no idea." His name was Tank, and he was what was left of Cutter's crew that still came around. He led her back through a dim hallway to a room that smelled of cold coffee and cigarettes, and there was the man in the chair. And within 90 seconds, the mug was flying and Cutter was roaring at her to get out. Which brings us right back to where we started. Rosa on her knees picking up glass. She didn't cry, she didn't run. She looked up at him with those glass shards in her palm and said in a flat voice, "You're going to cut your wheels on this and then you'll blame me for the flat." And she kept cleaning. Cutter opened his mouth to yell again and then he just didn't. He watched her instead. Nobody had ever answered him like that. Everybody either begged or bolted. This woman scolded him about his tires. That's when Diesel came in. The dog had slipped his rope, nosed the door open, and walked straight past Rosa like she wasn't even there. He crossed the room, put his gray head down on Cutter's dead knee, and let out a long, tired breath. And he stayed, right there at the wheels of the chair. Like he'd finally found the one thing he'd been looking for his whole life. Cutter Malone had not been touched gently by anything in 8 months. He stared down at that dog, and something in his chest went very quiet and very strange. "That your mutt?" he asked Rosa. "He's my father's," she said. "My father's dead." Cutter didn't say sorry, men like him don't, but he didn't tell the dog to move either, and Rosa noticed that. She noticed everything. That was the thing about her. 12 people had walked into this house and seen a monster. Rosa walked in and saw a man who'd been thrown away and knew exactly what that felt like because it had happened to her more than once. She finished the glass. She stood up. And instead of leaving, she opened the door of a closet, found a mountain of dirty laundry that hadn't been touched in who knows how long, and started to fold. "What are you doing?" Cutter said. It wasn't a question, it was a warning. "You want to fire me, Rosa said. But I'm not standing here doing nothing while there's work in front of me. That's not how I was raised." And she kept folding his shirts. Tank, watching from the doorway, slowly stopped laughing. By the end of that first day, Rosa had done 3 loads of laundry, scrubbed a week of dishes, and made a pot of beans that filled the whole house with a smell that wasn't cigarettes for the first time in months. Cutter didn't thank her. He barely spoke to her. But when she left that evening, Diesel didn't want to go. The old dog stood at the door and looked back at the man in the chair, and Cutter said, gruff, "Leave him. He can stay the night. You'll come back for him." It was the smartest thing he'd ever done, though he'd never have admitted it, because now she had to come back. And she did. The next morning, she was there at 7 with Mateo's school lunch already made and her own coffee in a paper cup, and Cutter Malone, the man who chewed through 12 assistants, opened the door and let number 13 in. He told himself it was because of the dog. He was lying to himself, and part of him already knew it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm nobody expected, least of all Cutter. Rosa showed up at 7. She cooked, she cleaned. She handled the pill bottles the doctors sent and lined them up in order so he'd stop skipping the ones he hated. She learned which mornings his back was bad and didn't make him talk on those. She figured out he hated the physical therapy exercises the county sent a man to do, so she did them with him herself, counting out loud, not letting him quit at 8 when the sheet said 10. She didn't baby him. That was the part he couldn't get over. When he snapped at her, she snapped right back. When he refused to eat, she set the plate down and said, "Then it'll be cold and that's your problem," and walked out of the room. She treated him like a man, not a patient. And slowly, without either of them naming it, the roaring stopped. But the crew was watching. And the crew did not like it. You have to understand what Cutter still meant to those men. He'd built the Iron Saints from nothing. Even broken, even in a chair, he was the president. And a president has enemies. There were people in Oakland who'd wanted Cutter dead for years, and the man who'd pulled the trigger on that highway had never been found. Some of the crew figured it was a rival club. Some figured it was closer to home. And now here was a stranger. A woman nobody knew, showing up every day, moving through the president's house, learning where everything was, learning his habits, his weak mornings, the layout of every room. Tank cornered her in the kitchen on the second week. "Who sent you?" he said. "Not friendly." The employment lady on Fruitville, Rosa said, not looking up from the sink. Nobody just shows up, Tank said. Not here, you know who he is. You know what happens to people who get close to him for the wrong reasons. He stepped closer, and he was a big man and the kitchen was small. 2 months before you came, a guy tried to sell information about this house, about where Cutter sleeps. You understand what I'm telling you. People die around here for less than what you're doing. Rosa turned around then. She was a foot shorter than Tank and she looked him dead in the eye. I know he hasn't had a real meal in months and nobody in this so-called family bothered to make him one, she said. You want to search my purse, search it. It's got $11 and a picture of my kid. Now move, you're blocking the drawer. Tank moved, but he didn't stop wondering, and that mattered because it's what set the whole rest of this in motion. Cutter, for his part, started doing something he hadn't done in years. He started talking. Not much. But at night, when Rosa was cleaning up and the house was quiet, he'd tell her things. How he used to ride up the coast with the wind coming off the water. How the club started with 4 guys and a broken-down garage. How he'd carried men out of 2 wars and buried a brother he loved more than his own blood. How the worst day of his life wasn't the day he got shot. It was the day after, when he woke up in the hospital and understood his legs were gone for good, and not one single person from his old life came to see him except Tank. And Tank only stayed 10 minutes. 12 of you before me, Rosa said one night. Why'd you run them all off? Cutter was quiet a long time. Then he said, because I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was already dead. They were just waiting around for the body to catch up. He looked at her. You don't look at me like that. That's because you're not dead, Rosa said. You're just stuck. There's a difference. I've been stuck. It's not the same as gone. She set the last plate in the rack and dried her hands. The year Mateo's father left, I didn't leave the apartment for a week except to work. I thought that was it. I thought the good part of my life had already happened and the rest was just paying for it. It wasn't true. It felt true. It wasn't. And Cutter Malone, who had faced down men with guns and never blinked, had to turn his face to the window so she wouldn't see what those words did to him. She started leaving a little later each night. He started leaving the porch light on for her, so the walk to her car wouldn't be dark. Neither of them mentioned it, but Diesel had stopped going home with her at all. The old dog lived at Cutter's feet now, day and night, and when Rosa arrived in the mornings, the first thing she saw through the window was that gray head resting on the president's knee, and the president's rough hand resting on the dog's back. Then came the Thursday that changed everything. It was pouring that day. The kind of Oakland rain that turns the whole world gray and loud. Rosa was late because Mateo had a fever and she'd had to drop him at her cousin's. She came in soaked, apologizing, and Cutter waved it off. But he was in a strange mood, restless. He'd gotten a phone call that morning and it had put a look on his face she hadn't seen before. A hard, old look. The look of the man he used to be. Sit down, he told her. There's something I got to say. She sat. I want to pay for your boy's school, Cutter said. The good one, the private one over the hill, and a house. A real house, not that apartment. He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. I got money doing nothing. It should do something. Rosa stared at him, and then she did the last thing he expected. She got angry. No, she said. No. I'm not for sale, Cutter, and neither is my son. You think that's what this is? You think I'm here folding your laundry so you'll write me a check? She stood up. I've had men try to buy me before. I thought you were different. That's not, Cutter started, and for the first time since she'd met him, the big man looked lost. That's not what I meant. I meant and he stopped. Because he didn't have the words. He'd never had the words for the thing he was feeling, and at 61 years old in a chair in the rain, he didn't know how to start. Rosa softened. She saw it. She saw the man trying and failing to say something true. She sat back down and took his hand, which nobody did, and she said, "Then just say the real thing, whatever it is. Say it plain." And Cutter opened his mouth to say the real thing. That's when the front door came off its hinges. Two men in the doorway, rain behind them, and a gun in the lead man's hand. It wasn't the crew. Rosa had never seen these faces, but Cutter had. Cutter went white, and then he went very, very still, and he said in a low voice, "The man who put me in this chair just walked into my house." Everything changed in that 1 second. This was no longer about a lonely old man and the woman who wouldn't quit. The gun swung between the two of them, and the man holding it smiled, and Rosa understood with a cold drop in her stomach that whoever wanted Cutter dead 8 months ago had finally come to finish the job. And now there was a witness. Now there was her. The lead man's name, it turned out, was Ray's. He'd been a saint once, years back, before Cutter threw him out of the club for stealing from the widow's fund, the money the club set aside for the wives of men who died. Cutter didn't forgive that, not stealing from widows. He'd taken Ray's patch in front of everyone, and a man doesn't come back from that. Ray's had wanted the president's chair. He'd wanted it bad enough to arrange a highway ambush, and when that only crippled Cutter instead of killing him, he'd waited. He'd waited 8 patient months for the old man to be alone and weak and forgotten. He hadn't counted on a woman being in the house. He especially hadn't counted on a dog. "Should have stayed down, Cutter," Ray's said, stepping over the broken door. Water ran off his jacket onto the floor. The second man moved to the side, cutting off the hall. "You had a good run. Time to let it go." "Let her leave," Cutter said. His voice was steady now. Whatever fear he'd felt was gone, folded away somewhere. This was the president talking. "She's the help. She's got nothing to do with any of this. Let her walk out and you and me finish it." "Can't do that," Ray said. "She's seen my face, you know how it works." And there it was. No witnesses. The whole nature of the thing had turned. This wasn't about Cutter's old grudges anymore. It was about a mother with a sick boy at her cousin's house who was now standing between 2 armed men and a way out. Rosa's hands were shaking. But her voice, when it came, was not. "My son is 8 years old," she said. "He's got nobody but me. You point that gun somewhere else." Ray's laughed. "Tough lady, Cutter, where'd you find her?" He raised the gun toward Rosa. "Sorry, sweetheart, nothing personal. Now here's where I have to slow down and tell you exactly what happened, because it happened fast and every piece of it mattered. The first thing was Cutter's hand. All those months in the chair, he'd built his arms into something terrible out of pure rage and boredom. He kept a length of steel chain looped under the seat of that wheelchair, had for weeks, because a president plans for the day his enemies remember he's still breathing. His hand found it. And with one motion, he flung it low and hard, and it wrapped around Ray's ankles just as the man's finger tightened. The shot went into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. The second thing was Diesel. That old gray dog, that clicking hip, half-lame dog who'd done nothing for weeks but lay at a broken man's feet, came off the floor like something 20 years younger. He'd heard the fear in Rosa's voice. He'd chosen his master, and his master was in that chair, and the world was full of threat. 90 pounds of German Shepherd hit Ray's in the chest and drove him down into the doorframe, teeth in the man's gun arm, and Ray's screamed and the gun skittered across the wet floor and spun to a stop. At Rosa's feet. The second man lunged for it. Rosa got there first. She'd never held a gun in her life. She picked it up in both shaking hands and pointed it at him and said, "Don't." And something in her face made him stop cold, because it was the face of a mother, and there is nothing on this earth more dangerous. "On the floor," Cutter said. He'd wheeled himself around, and old as he was, broken as he was, his voice filled that whole room. "Both of you, down, now. The dog will take your throat next, and I will let him." Ray's was down already, Diesel's jaws locked on his arm, howling. The second man got on his knees, hands up. And that's how Tank and two other saints found them, 60 seconds later when they came roaring up the dead-end street. Because Cutter, in the one moment he'd had before the door came down, had hit a button on an old panic pager clipped under his chair. A president plans for everything. Tank took one look at Ray's on the floor and went a color Rosa had never seen a man turn. "You," Tank said, "it was you. All this time it was you." "I'll spare you the next part mostly." The Saints dealt with Ray's and his man in the way the Iron Saints deal with things, which is to say the police were never called, and neither Ray's nor his partner were ever seen in Oakland again. Rosa didn't ask. Cutter didn't tell. Some doors you don't open. But she noticed that when it was over, when the house was empty again and it was just the two of them and a shaking old dog, Cutter reached down and pulled Diesel up against him and held that dog like a drowning man holds a rope, and his shoulders were shaking, and Cutter Malone, president of the Iron Saints, was crying. Not from fear. He'd faced worse. He was crying because for the first time in his whole hard life, when the guns came out, two living things had stood between him and death without being paid to, without being ordered to, for no reason at all except that they'd decided he was worth it. A stray dog and a diner waitress. That was his family now. That was what was left, and it was more than he'd had in 30 years of leather and steel. If you're still with me this far, do me one small thing and hit that subscribe button, because this next part is the reason I wanted to tell you this story at all. "You saved my life," he said to Rosa when he could talk. "Diesel saved your life," Rosa said. "I just held the gun." "You didn't run." Cutter looked at her and his scarred face was wet and open in a way that no man in Oakland had ever seen it. 13 of you came through that door, and you didn't run. Why? And Rosa, who had every reason in the world to have run, sat down on the floor next to his chair, next to the trembling dog, in the wreck of the broken doorway with the rain coming in, and she told him the truth. "Because I know what it's like to have everyone decide you're finished," she said. "When Mateo's father left, people looked at me the way your crew looked at you, like I was already over, 26 and done, and I decided I'd rather work myself to the bone than ever look at somebody the way they looked at me." She took his hand again. "You're not a job to me, Cutter. You stopped being a job about the second day. I don't know what you are yet, but you're not a job." The porch light was still on. It threw a warm square through the doorway onto the wet floor, and Cutter Malone finally said the real thing, the thing he'd been trying to say when the door came down. "Stay," he said. "Not for the money, burn the money, I mean you and the boy. This house is too big and I'm too old, and there's a dog here who thinks he's mine now anyway." He gripped her hand. "I spent my whole life making men afraid of me. I don't want to be feared anymore, Rosa. I want to be worth coming back to. You made me want that. Stay." Rosa Delgado looked at this ruined, roaring, weeping old outlaw, and she thought about her boy with his fever at her cousin's, and $11, and a life of choosing hard over easy every single time. And she made one more choice. "Okay," she said, "we'll stay." The rest of it came slow, the way real things do. Mateo moved into the big back bedroom that got the morning sun. The boy was scared of Cutter for about a day and a half, right up until Cutter taught him how to rebuild a carburetor at the kitchen table, grease up to both their elbows, and after that the boy followed the old man around like a second dog. Diesel didn't mind. There was room in that house for all of it now. Rosa would come in from the store and find the two of them, the old outlaw and the boy, heads bent over some engine part, Cutter's rough voice explaining torque and timing like it was scripture, and she'd stand in the doorway a moment before she said anything, just to keep the picture a little longer. Cutter never walked again. Let me be honest with you, because this isn't that kind of story. There was no miracle where he stood up. The chair stayed, but a strange thing happened to the man in it. He started calling the crew together again, not for the old business, the business that got men shot, but for the club's charity runs, the toy drives at Christmas, the fundraisers for the kids at the county hospital. He'd sit at the head of the table in his chair, and the Iron Saints would go quiet when he spoke, same as always, except now what came out of his mouth was about protecting people instead of scaring them. Tank said it was the woman. Tank was right. Rosa never went back to the diner. Cutter tried exactly once to pay her a wage for running the house, and she looked at him so hard he never brought it up again. They weren't employer and help. They'd stopped being that on the floor of a broken doorway. What they became, they never put a fancy name on. She had her own room, he had his. But every evening they sat on that porch together, under the light he still left on out of habit, and watched the rain come down over Oakland, and the old dog lay between them with his gray head on the president's foot that couldn't feel it, and they talked until it got dark. One night, near the end of that first year, Mateo asked Cutter why he'd been so mean to all the people who came before his mom. Kids ask the questions grown-ups won't. Cutter thought about it for a long while. Then he said, "Because I was so scared of being left, boy, that I left everybody first. I thought if I threw them out, it wouldn't hurt when they went." He reached down and scratched Diesel behind the ears. Turns out the trick isn't finding people who won't leave. It's being the kind of man they don't want to. He looked over at Rosa across the porch. "Your mother taught me that. Took her about 3 weeks." Remember how this started. A mug against the wall. A man roaring at a stranger to get out like all the others. Broken glass on the floor and a woman on her knees who wouldn't run. If you'd walked past that house that first day, you'd have seen a monster and a fool, and you'd have been wrong on both counts. Because that was the day a thrown-away man met a woman the world had also thrown away, and neither one of them had the good sense to quit on the other. He'd spent 30 years believing the only thing that kept a man safe was making the whole world afraid of him. And in the end, what saved his life wasn't fear at all. It was a diner waitress who folded his laundry, and an old dog who chose him, and a light left on over an empty porch for someone who kept coming back. Cutter Malone died 6 years later in his sleep in that house, an old man surrounded by the only real family he ever had. Rosa was in the next room. The dog was gone by then, buried under the tree in the yard, and they buried Cutter beside him, which is exactly what he'd asked for. Not next to his old club brothers. Next to the dog who stood between him and a bullet for no reason but love. At the funeral, 100 bikers in black leather stood in the rain with their heads down. And Mateo, 17 now, tall, going off to college on money Cutter had put away in his name, stood up in front of all of them and said the truest thing anybody said that whole day. "He wasn't my father," the boy said, "but he taught me everything a father's supposed to. He taught me that the strongest thing a man can do isn't scaring people. It's staying. It's leaving the light on. It's letting somebody in when everything in you wants to slam the door." The boy's voice cracked. "My mom didn't quit on him, and he never quit on us. That's the whole story. That's the only thing that ever mattered." And Rosa Delgado, standing in the Oakland rain among 100 hard men who were all quietly weeping, thought about $11 in a purse and a mug against a wall, and the day she decided not to run. She'd walked into that house to earn a paycheck. She'd walked out of that whole chapter of her life having done something bigger. She'd taken a man the world had left for dead and reminded him, one folded shirt at a time, that he was still worth loving. That's what breaks you open in the end. Not the bullets, not the fists, Just somebody who looks at the worst of you and decides to stay anyway. Believe me, it'll get you every time.